So like all of our 4-H events, we like to start with the 4-H pledge. So you can do that with me as I talk it through. I pledge my head to clear thinking, my heart to greater loyalty, my hands to larger service, my health to better living, for my family, my club, my community, my country, and my world. All right, thanks for doing the pledge with us. And just another reminder of participating in a 4-H online opportunities. If you can remain muted as our presenters are talking, they will have time that they will have you unmute and ask your questions, but just for ease of their presenting, if you can stay muted until you're instructed to unmute. Put your questions in the chat. If you're thinking of something and the presenter is talking, throw your question in the chat. We've got Becca and Nick watching the chats, so we'll bring those questions forward as you have those. If you're one that likes to put or do some kind of goofy things in the chat, we'll remind you once. And if you do it again, we will remove you from the opportunity. We want to make sure the chat stays open for questions and we can get those comments to our presenters. And we're going to let you have your cameras on because it's fun to see who is doing what as we're presenting. So your cameras will be on as we're doing the presentations. So with that, Nick, I'm going to stop sharing and then you can share your screen.
So our theme this month, I guess, for this month's webinar was greenhouses. But one of the things that you have to talk about when you talk about greenhouses is soil temperature. And you don't really think about it too often. A lot of people think about the temperature outside, you know, whether it's freezing or not. But soil temperature is also very important to farmers and for gardeners, especially if you're trying to control that soil temperature and make it optimal. So thinking about soil temperature, you can kind of think about it in terms of air temperature. And what are some things that change the temperature of the air? What do we know about the air and what changes there? What do you guys think? What's something that changes the temperature of the air?
Ocean. Humidity.
Humidity is one.
In the chat, Nick, there's heat, weather and water, sunlight.
Okay.
Frost.
So yeah, all those things can have an effect on the change in the air temperature, especially what time of the year it is and how much sunlight we're getting, right? How close we are to the sun changes the temperature of the air in our atmosphere. And if you think about what changes air temperature, some of the same things can change the temperature of the soil. So one of the things that changes temperature of the soil is the air temperature itself. But what are some other things that change the temperature of the soil, do you think, then? Feel free to shout it out or put it down in the chat box.
We've got a snow cover in the chat.
Yep. Yep, snow cover is a good one. What else? What else covers the ground that could change the temperature of the soil?
Deep frost is another one. The sun.
Yep, the sun, for sure, the sun. Exposure to sunlight. I see water in there. Water also changes the temperature. All right, leaves and grass. That's a good one as well. So any kind of vegetation or even decaying organic matter, like mulch, Britta says, on the top of the soil, can change the soil temperature as well, or help to hold in the heat that it does get. So one of the things about soil is that it holds heat better than air does. And so it's more insulated from changes in temperature than the air is. But over time, it slowly adjusts itself based on, whatever factors are affecting that temperature. Like we just said, sunlight, the amount of moisture, etc. So the heat in the soil is protected by the soil above it and the vegetation that sits on top of that, and then also snow cover, like we said. So those types of things help to insulate the soil and keep a constant temperature. And actually, the deeper you go, to a point, the higher the average air temp or soil temperature is. So from about 30 feet below the ground down to about 200 feet, the soil stays at a pretty constant 55 degrees. But if we're thinking about it in terms of plants are growing sort of on the surface and in the top layer. And the temperature in that top layer of soil can change quite a bit, depending on what's going on top of it. So we talked about water. The amount of water in the soil really affects this temperature quite a bit. So you can see this on a hot summer day. Dry soil, especially like sand on a beach, can get really hot. Now that's an extreme example, but it also happens in soil that we want to be growing stuff in fields. So sandy soil that's kind of dry, it will get really dry and hot and crack like you see in that top picture up there. But soil that stays wet will stay cooler, and it'll clump together more. And so you'll kind of see those differences in soil, and it changes throughout the year depending on what's going on with the weather and all those other factors that we had that affects it. So thinking about plants and whether you're planting things in your garden or out in a field, it's important for farmers and gardeners to know their soil temperature. So here's a chart on the side here that shows different temperatures in the soil that a lot of common crops that we have can be planted at, and then the optimal temperature, that soil temperature that they will germinate at. So you can see some of these ones in the top up here, beets, carrots, lettuce, parsley, radishes, and spinach. Those all can be planted when the soil is relatively cold at 45 degrees. And we call those like a cool season crops. And that's because it's mostly in reference there to the soil temperature, and they can be planted and will germinate at lower soil temperatures than most other things. And then it kind of goes up the line here, and you can see corn right here, which is pretty common. We want that to be, for planting, we want that to be about 55 degrees. But we only plant corn a couple inches deep, right? As it warms up throughout the year, or throughout the spring, I should say, the soil temperature starts to rise, and in the top few inches of soil becomes actually quite a bit warmer than air temperatures are on most days. And so you can see an optimal temp for germination for corn is at 95 degrees. So during that time that we look at the window for planting corn, you can see how much the soil temperature will change from the time that we plant until the time it germinates, which is often not too many days. So it becomes kind of fascinating if you're monitoring soil temperature, to watch that. And so many farmers will wait for certain times of the year. If you've got, a number of acres to put in, this temperature right here for planting is, sort of negotiable. This is sort of, the lowest practical temperature that you can plant at. And oftentimes we're still planting, farther up this temperature continuum when the soil is still warming up. So you can still plant during any of these temperatures up until it gets to the point where it's going to be germinating. So, and when you get close, it'll germinate really quick. So, and then you see tomatoes, they can be planted that cold. Then you get to things like cucumbers and peppers, and those are normally grown, or were originally grown in sort of more tropical climates or hotter climates. So you think of peppers growing, down in Mexico and places like that. They take a warmer soil temperature before they can be planted. But then you see that they germinate relatively quickly, like before corn does on the soil temperature scale. So that's very interesting. And, this is kind of a good reference chart for you guys to have if you're planting things in your garden, and to think about soil temperature and maybe start monitoring that and thinking about when you can plant those things. All right, so now we're going to get into doing some actual measuring of soil temperature. So I asked you guys to have like a thermometer with you today if you had one. And I'm just using, this is actually a thermometer that you can use in the kitchen for like meat. Works the same as a soil temperature probe. You can see a picture of one here. Looks very similar to this. Mine's a digital one. And so I have some plants from different parts of the house that are sitting right next to me here. And I want to see if I can turn my camera here so that you can see that. All right, give me 1 second here. All right, so this is a Christmas cactus that I hopefully you guys can see that, that I had planted or sitting on the south part of my house, and it's a very old Christmas cactus, and it is blooming right now. But we're trying to kind of nurse this one back to life. It kind of went through some trouble, but we got it sitting kind of in a south window here. And you can see my son's crazy decorations that he's placed in the plant here. But if you put the soil temperature probe in here, this side was kind of facing the south part of the window. And you can see I have about 75 degrees there in the soil temperature. And in the room here, it's probably closer to about 68 or so, something like that. And if you place the probe in the opposite side of this thing, you can kind of see the soil temperature is already falling. And that's because this side of the plant was closer to the south window and the sunlight than this was. And you can see it's at least 1 degree different on the other side of the pot. So in the house, you can sort of see the variation in temperature that you can get. So that was the south facing one. Anybody else have a south facing plant that they can measure the temperature of?
Britta has one. Her coffee plant is in a south-facing window and has a temperature of 65 degrees.
Okay, 65. So you're getting a little bit cooler than. Whoops. Sorry about that. But you're getting a little bit cooler there in your house. You must have it must be just a little bit colder there than it is in my house, or at least in the south room where I had my plant. Anybody else measure a temperature of a plant that was in the south part of the house or facing the sun? All right, nothing else right now. Okay, I'm going to kind of reset my temperature probe here. And let's see. I'm going to try another plant that I've got here. This is an aloe plant. And I had this kind of on the more north side of my house for a few days and kind of adjusted to the temperature over there. And it's just been kind of shedding a lot of its lower leaves here lately, but it's a little bit more rockier soil. It's a little bit drier. And so I'm hoping that this one's going to be a little bit cooler than the last one was, or it should be. And see the temperature's kind of going down. This one's sitting, looks like just shy of 74, so still pretty warm. Well, it's still going down a little bit. But things vary, just by a few degrees, at least in the house here. And so this plant is just a little bit cooler. But you can see it's been, sitting in the warm house, and it's a pretty warm day today outside. And I still have my my pellet stove burning downstairs, and so it's been pretty warm inside the house. And so the soil is picking up that warmth, and it's holding it pretty well, even though it's probably only 68 or 69 degrees inside the house.
Nick, we had a few more responses. Someone has a hanging green arrow leaf in a hanging pot with a temperature of 62. Another group has a plant that's at about 70.
Okay.
Some west window plants are around 70 to 72.
Okay. So yeah, west window plants are probably not quite in the sun as much, but just a couple degrees cooler there again. So it's pretty interesting to see around the house the kinds of temperatures that you can get in the soil. And the same thing happens outside depending on what's going on. So does anybody have like a plant was sitting like in a cold area of the house or a drafty area of the house?
I have one by my vent.
Okay.
Yeah, we have one in our we have 2 geraniums in our garage, and the garage is running about like 60 degrees, so probably closer to 50 at times, like sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Britta?
I have a question about my lemon tree. Last time I asked about it, and it had like 10, 20 leaves, and we trimmed it, put it in a new pot, rinsed the leaves off, put in aphid traps, and now it has 1 leaf.
Hmm.
And it's right next to the dog bed. Do you think that the dogs have anything to do with it?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. Might have to think about that one, and maybe we can get that answered for you at some point a little bit later here.
Is it too late for it to have lemons?
That I don't know. Things can be different when when it's a plant that's sitting indoors and it's not outside exposed to, natural weather patterns and stuff. So I'm not real sure on a lemon tree, but.
Oh, well, at least it still has 1 leaf.
Nick, we did have another question earlier. If you have a plant that the seed started in the house, when should it be put outside? Would it still be the green practical temperature for planting? Not sure what the last part. When should they put it outside, I guess is the question.
So if you got one that started in the house, you would be sort of controlling that soil temperature by, sorry, I keep clicking on this wrong screen here. You would be sort of controlling the soil temperature by, when you planted it, and the how you were treating it inside the house before you went to put it outside. As far as like an air temperature for outside, you don't want it to have it exposed to any frost or anything. But oftentimes, I'll take plants that I started inside the house, and then I'll condition them to be outside by putting them outside, like in a cooler on cooler days and stuff like that, to start getting them used to being transplanted outside, and then the cooler temperatures that they'll experience over the night time once they're transplanted. And it helps to kind of condition the plants to do well when they're transplanted, so they don't get wilty on you and stuff right away and have a hard time coming back from the shock of being transplanted. So hopefully that sort of answers that question. It just depends on kind of what the temperature's like outside, but you just don't want them to freeze really, or get real close to freezing either. So especially right away when you put them out. So a lot of times I'll put them in kind of surround them with some hay or straw bales, and then put like a piece of plywood over the top and leave them out overnight. And it kind of protects them from super cold temperatures, but they'll get cool enough. And then I take the plywood off during the day so they get sunlight and everything like that. So it's kind of just something that we've done on our farm for quite a number of years that works pretty well. So all right, and then I had kind of wet versus dry. If you have like plants that are a little bit drier inside the house, you could, if you're curious, you could look at the difference in temperature between a wet and a dry plant. Some plants you don't want to have, for house plants, you don't want to have as much moisture. Some need a little bit more. So depending on what's going on there, you can kind of measure the differences in soil temperature too on those. Let's see, what else is in the chat here? Am I missing anything else?
Nope, I think you've got it.
Okay. All right. Well, that's pretty much the activity for measuring the soil temperature. Like I said, if you're curious, you can keep going. Try different ones. You can move plants around the house and let them acclimate to the temperature there, and then see what the differences are. But thinking about this in terms of agricultural production, what are some things that we do then to help manage soil temperature for agricultural production? What do you guys think?
Water it maybe.
Yep. Water it so it doesn't get too dry, right? We don't want it to get too hot.
You could maybe put in a greenhouse.
There you go. That was my hint, the picture right below. You can use a greenhouse. That's one of our big tools that we use to manage soil temperature. And we can manage it pretty precisely in a greenhouse setting where we can control all the factors that affect soil temperature. So we're controlling the air temperature, we're controlling the amount of sunlight that it's exposed to, we're controlling the amount of moisture that it gets, all those things. So in a greenhouse setting, which is what our theme is for the month today, we can manage soil temperature. And it's one of the main ways that we do it for ag production. The other thing for outside of a greenhouse, we maybe can't change soil temperature out in a field setting like we could in a greenhouse, but we can monitor the soil temperature in fields, and we can decide, when we want to plant based on monitoring that soil temperature. So that's a way that we manage it as well, even though we're not actually changing it. All right. And that's kind of leads us into our guest speaker today, who's going to talk a little bit more about greenhouses, I believe. So
thanks, Nick. If you want to stop sharing, then I'm going to share Andrea's slide and we'll introduce Andrea. Maybe as I'm doing that, Becca, you can introduce Andrea for me.
I sure can. We have Andrea Johnson with us today. She is a master gardener in Swift County. If you remember back to last month, we had another master gardener, Lori, and she was from what county, Brian?
Steele County.
Steele County. So we're getting good use out of our master gardeners we have through Extension. So thanks for joining us today, Andrea. We'll turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Becca. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay, so, well, what is a greenhouse? You can see in my photo here what had started out as my greenhouse last year. I like to think of a greenhouse as something that just lets in light and heat and traps it to help plants grow when it's still cold outside. And if any of you would like to make a guess in the chat box about if you were, I know some of us are south of the Twin Cities and some of us are north, but according to University of Minnesota climatologist Mark Seeley, in the last 20 years, what's our average date for our last frost that we get in the spring? If you want to make a guess and put that in the. So so the greenhouse is something that lets in the light and heat and traps it to help plants grow when it's still cold outside. But we can do some things in our short season, so we can start leafy vegetables and some of those things earlier in the spring. And it all depends on how much you want to watch the weather and how much you want to baby your vegetables. So as Nick said, lettuce, spinach, kale, or even Swiss chard can germinate at temperatures as low as 45 degrees and grow at warmer temperatures, but they can be planted at 45 degrees. So, well, first of all, I'm seeing there's a couple of guesses. Brian, did you want to note that at all, or?
Yep, I can. Looks like we've got some guesses. The first part of spring. I saw one in March, June 1st, April, June 15th, May, April 18th, September 27th.
Okay, so according to Mark Seeley, in the last 20 years around the Twin Cities, April 20th was the average date for the last frost. So even if our soils are cooler than 50 degrees, there might be opportunities to do some, if you have something that works as a greenhouse. First thing I wanted to show you is a very simple greenhouse I did a few years ago. So this is a straw bale that has been conditioned, but you could also use a pot. You could use some kind of a container, and the plastic on top needs to have a rating of 2 to 3 MIL. Bit thicker plastic, and so I am hoping that maybe you can draw some pictures of what you think might work as your own greenhouse in the spring. And it could be a straw bale or something like that that you can actually heat up a little bit from the inside, or you could even use a container. Now, if you've using some pots or straw bale, you you can use a couple of posts and pound those into the ground, and then use a wire along the top, and then you can string your plastic out on each side, like you're hanging sheets on a clothesline. And that works really well for protecting those young seeds and seedlings. One thing about pounding in posts, and this is something you have to work with your parents on, is there's a website called gopherstate1call.org. And you go there and you fill out a ticket. And then what happens is in the next few days, representatives of the utility companies come out and they mark the areas where you might have underground lines. So you want to make sure you don't pound in a post directly over that underground line. But they do this at no cost to you or to your family. And it makes it so you can pound in those posts in an area that's safe. Okay, so I'm thinking you might want to draw some pictures of something like this, and you could use a pot in a way that prevents the wind from blowing in. You could use your home to block the wind while giving your greenhouse as much access to light as you can. There should be as much light as possible. You're looking at where the sun is in the morning and how it travels across the sky and where it ends up in the nighttime. So you can have as much light as possible. And you also want to make sure there's some airflow inside your greenhouse. Okay, next one is 1 year I started my lettuce and Swiss chard and spinach in an old pallet. And I just took some Miracle-Gro soil and I kind of mixed in some twigs and leaves. You could even put in some shredded paper, and that just kind of helps with drainage and aerating the soil. Not too much, but just makes it so water can drain through. And in this case, you can just put your plastic over the top somehow, and that lettuce germinates and starts to grow. And then as it warms up, take that off and you can have your own little salad bar. The important thing is to work with your weather. If it's too cold for the grass to turn green, or if there are frost warnings, you need to hold off on setting up a greenhouse that doesn't have a form of heat. So have fun and experiment and see what works for you. Now I'd like to show you my greenhouse. And I got the directions from Joel Karsten, who has been working on straw bale gardens all around the world. So here is a greenhouse that I made. I set my straw bales up around the outside, and I had my 2x4s, and I had 2 cattle panels that I bent around, and then I covered it with that 2 to 3 MIL plastic tape. So there is a place for you to get these directions on my next slide. It's the 6-week greenhouse in 6 steps. You can look that up online. And I don't know if you can click on that so we can see that. And there it is. Joel Karsten started this method, and that's what it will look like. So I think you can explore that more if you're interested. And then I have a photo of what my greenhouse looked like last year on May 16th. So I did a lot of planting in late April last year. I made a little movie that I'd like to show you now from April 25th. that shows how it got to this point.
This straw bale is ready for me to plant. I've conditioned it for 2 weeks. I've put nitrogen in it. It's been thoroughly soaked. And the temperature inside the bale is about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you'll see there's kettle panels here, and my idea is to have pole beans grow up all the way to the top and over to make an arch. And that's for my friend Jennifer Gorham, so that she can sit out here and enjoy this. I think I'll enjoy it too. So the first step is to put a little bit of soil here, and I just have some soil I had left over from last year. I'm just going to just sprinkle it here. Now if you really want to know how to do this, go to Joel Carston's Learn to Grow a Straw Bale Garden, because he is the expert and he developed this method. So since I'm going to be planting seeds here in April, which is very early for West Central Minnesota, I'm just spreading a little bit of potting soil on here first. Okay, so I've got that. Now what I want to do is I want to just make a little design, a little template with my cup here. So I'm just going to go like that all the way along, so I know where to plant my green beans. And these are early maturing pole beans. Okay, so then I just have the beans here, and I'm just going to stick one in each of those spots. You don't have to be fancy, and the big thing with straw bale gardening is you don't want to overseed the bales, because the plants just grow so big and it doesn't do any good if they're crowded. I love this method because there's no weeding, and when you plant individual seeds like this, you don't really have to worry about you know, pulling out seedlings that when there's too many. And it's always hard to pull out a seedling when you've gone to all the work of planting it and seeing it grow. Now in the front of this, I'm going to plant spinach, and I've already done this to 2 other bales. I'm going to wait with my other 3 bales as I'm going to get some tomatoes and squash and sweet potatoes and things like that to put in my straw bale garden. I also want to plant some gourds that are going to stream over the top of the greenhouse. Now, a few of you have asked me about the smell, and I would say, yeah, I have been dealing with some smell in my greenhouse this last 2 weeks. It's not too bad right now, but there's been times when it's been a pretty strong ammonia smell. And I guess I would refer you to Joel Carston and see what he says about that. I guess I did ask, and he said, you know, be sure you keep the sides or front of the greenhouse open during the day, or whatever you need to do, and make sure it doesn't get too warm inside as well. Eventually that smell should go away. But I've noticed with other methods of straw bale gardening that I've done, I haven't really had a problem with that. And I think that's because I didn't have it covered. So I've been straw bale gardening for about, I'd say at least 6 years. And it's worked out great for me. Generally what I'll do is I'll just put 1 tomato in a bale, and that's where I've had my greatest success, because I've been able to grow about 100 tomatoes per plant, and I'm not a big canner or freezer, and so I am able to use that amount throughout growing season. By early December, I'm pretty tired of tomatoes, and so I'm ready for a break until spring. Well, I have some good things planted here, and I can't wait to see the spinach and the green beans pop up out of the ground and eventually have good things to eat here in West Central Minnesota. Thank you.
Okay, so that's where I was at last year in April. We'll see what April has in store this year. I still have the same structure up. I'll put the plastic back on it and see what happens. So now I'd like to show you a picture of, okay, so here's that bale on May 16th, and it looks pretty crowded to me. I should have probably put about half the number of plants in there that I had. And so I'm going to work with that a little bit this year. I think using a palette also within my greenhouse for this year coming up. Let's look at what the garden looked like on June 25th. Okay, here is some lettuce and onions I was eating by before the 1st of July, and then this is looked in early August, and I was getting all sorts of vegetables, and I could just reach up and get some cucumbers and some beans. So it was a lot of fun. You can also see around the front, I've put some chicken wire, which worked great to keep out the bunnies in my town. And so, yeah, that's my greenhouse. After seeing this, I'd love to read or hear about what ideas you have for planting things in the springtime and what plans you might need to make that happen.